Good evening. Microphone is on? Yeah? Could you please take your seats? Welcome to this next keynote lecture. Those that are here in this classroom, in this hall, and those that are watching and following from somewhere else. We just said this is for the people here a dangerous evening because the weather is nice, and Münster is a perfect place to sit on a terrace and have some drink. But we're sure there will be plenty of time to do that afterwards. So tonight, as is on the program, we welcome Professor Vassilis Saroglou, Professor of Psychology of Religion, Personality Psychology, and Cross-Cultural Psychology at the Université Catholique de Louvain, which does not translate as Catholic University of Leuven. That is because of religious illiteracy, maybe good to explain. Professor Saroglou has done extensive research and published a lot on the psychology of religion, spirituality, fundamentalism, and atheism, and their respective cognitive, emotional, moral, social, and cultural characteristics. He received several scientific distinctions from American and European and also other associations. I have here his latest book, The Psychology of Religion, published by Routledge. And on the back, I don't know if you defined these questions, but one of the questions you will answer in the book, or you answer in the book, is, does religion positively affect well-being? Well, maybe we hear something of the answer. What we do know is that a conference on religion is very positively affecting the well-being of people, especially here in Münster. So thanks, Hans-Peter, for hosting us. You have said words of thanks to many at the beginning, but I want to say thanks to you because you're the CEO of this organization. Thanks a lot for having us and for hosting us. Because of that, the announcement that after the plenary and the discussion, there is a reception again at the same place as last night. And for those that have arrived today, just follow the herd and you'll get to the drinks. Those that are watching online, you can ask your questions in the chat, and I will receive them here on the iPad so we can consider them in the discussion afterwards. But first, we are happy to listen to you, please.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks the Academy, the President and the Board for inviting me and give me this honor to address to you here in Münster and to you online. Of course, it's a bit dangerous moment. It's the end of the day. It's pretty sunny, and yeah, but I am here, so, and you are here, so you are very welcome. Just a preliminary remark, because there have been some discussions and comments the last 2 days on the relations between theology and religion. So, in fact, when we are doing psychology of religion, we don't study religion per se. Okay, that's the theologians who do that. So, what we study in psychology? We study people. Okay, so psychology of religion means psychology of religious people, in fact. And this means, if we follow the classic classification, religious people's beliefs, feelings, and behavior. And you can add many other constructs from psychology, like attitudes, identities, values, personality. So when I received the invitation for this conference with this theme, and I read the question as elaborated by the President in the call for applications for submissions regarding the relation between religion and theology and change, I took really this as a challenge because from a psychological perspective, there is nothing on that. So there is nothing on religion and change, psychologically speaking, so it was a real challenge to work on this. And I will apply, let's say, more kind of thinking perspective from, of course, my knowledge of the field and a bit beyond psychology also. And so I will not bother you with studies, data, numbers, etc. It will be more a reflection. So we can simply ask, does religion, does faith, does theology implies change or continuity or sameness? And of course, there are arguments for both. There are theological and historical arguments for both. And I will not use, of course, the case of dogmas. And of course, as theologians, I am originally a theologian, so I can just say sometimes as theologians, though I think as psychologists normally, preferably. But I think, yeah, let's say it's not the easiest way if we have to think about dogmas. So let's think on minor issues, not dogmas. For instance, if we take a first example in favor of an argument in favor for change, if you see how Christianity at least has evolved in terms of its attitude towards laughter and humor. So in early Christianity, there was a suspicion, even sometimes a condemnation of immoderate laughter and even humor sometimes. That was pretty clear in the early patristic period. And then Thomas Aquinatus, let's say, proposed a more moderate position. Laughter and humor are okay as necessary means to get some rest, to continue the spiritual fight. That's the argument. And then today you have nice volumes, both in biblical studies and in theology, arguing, of course, that humor and laughter may be theologically good tools in your spiritual pathway. Or you can say, this suspicion remains to some point, but it's not more the mainstream position, but it is the position today of some radicals or conservative who are a minority. A second example of change let's say, in a surprising direction is what happens today in the Christian Orthodox world. So I was born in '66, so I did not experience that period, but when I read texts of the 50s and the 60s, it's amazing. For instance, in Greece, that I know better, the use of the adjective Christian was everywhere. So we were speaking of Christian faith, of the Christian Testament, the Christian liturgy, the Christian community. Today, and when I say today, this started in the 2000s, it's amazing. You will find almost nothing. No use of the adjective Christian, but systematically the use of the qualification Orthodox. So you have Orthodox liturgy, Orthodox faith, Orthodox spirituality, Orthodox ecclesiastic law, etc. Really, try to make the test, there is almost nothing. Not in the theological work, in the everyday, let's say, experience of people and the official texts as you can read them by the church and by faithful. Now, on the contrary, two arguments, historical or theological, in favor of continuity, that there is no change. It's a bit a tricky argument, but I was thinking, in justice, sometimes you have a kind of consideration of mistakes, and then you have a miscarriage of justice. As far as I know, at least for the Orthodox world, there has never been, let's say, an historical discovery that made us saying that this saint is no more saint because we discover some ugly things. And a second argument in favor of the idea of continuity or sameness rather than change is today's liturgical language, I think in both Slavon and Greek Orthodox worlds. So let's say again for Greece, it's just Byzantine Greek, so nobody understands. So people understand some words, but not what the text is saying. It is a bit amazing because we have been raised with the argument that the Orthodox spirituality since the Byzantine times has been a spirituality in favor of acculturation. Okay? Why? Because the Byzantines adapted the Bible and the liturgy in the local language. And the Westerners and the Catholic Church stay with the Latin. So we Orthodox are more, let's say, adaptive in the cultures, contrary to the Westerners. But then the same people who say this argument at the same time forget that now nobody understands nothing, and Vatican II moved ahead. But to say that religion implies both change and continuity and sameness is, of course, a trivial argument. Why it is a trivial argument? Because first, that's inherent to life and all living entities. There is identity, essence, sense of self, but also you have influence of time, and then this refers to beings, to objects, to institutions, to ideas. And the second argument, that it is more psychological, from a personality psychology perspective, we know that there always have been and there will always be conservative and progressive people. So there are individual differences distinguished between open-minded and not open-minded people. And these differences are stable within individuals across the lifespan and within societies. Why these individual differences are stable? It is because of biological and genetic influences. To say that and give you just a number, 50% at least of the variation between conservatives and liberals is due to genetic and biological influences. And if you are familiar with the basic personality factor that is called today the Big Five factor model, the key factor here is openness to experience. So there is enormous variability on this factor, whether you are open to many kinds of things, ideas, experiences, values, or the opposite. You are not open. And this variability shapes the flexibility or inflexibility in all aspects of life. Political attitudes, moral attitudes, religious attitudes, and even many, many other things. Now, a kind of parenthesis that it's not necessarily a parenthesis because we will make some applications in the religious domain, is that today there is what we call an evolutionary understanding of why these individual differences exist and why they are stable, but also why there are changes within societies, and sometimes the mean level of openness increases and sometimes the mean level of openness decreases. And when I say sometimes, these are changes across decades or across centuries, of course. It's not small changes of 3 or 5 years. So there are two theories. The first theory is the fluctuating optimum, and the idea is pretty simple, and I think in the first keynote, Judith Wolf referred to the idea of scarcity of resources, is clearly changes in open-mindedness or closed-mindedness may be due to changes in environmental conditions. Okay, so the more, for instance, you have a crisis, the more you have intergroup conflicts, etc., the more people become conservative, etc. And the opposite. And this variation, as a function of the environmental conditions which change, applies across time, so historically, and across space if you compare cross-sectionally different societies. So that was the first theory. The second theory, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, it's a bit simple theory, but nice in a way. And it is called the dependence frequency. The idea is that there are always minorities and majorities on any personality trait, and then the minority becomes attractive. Being part of the minority is attractive, and then the more and more people are changing to become like the minority. And then when the minority becomes a majority, so when everybody becomes open-minded, then to be conservative is attractive, and then it changes. And you can apply this to all personality differences. So there is the idea is that there is a kind of pendulum, and then it goes up and down. So this applies some variability in flexibility or in open-mindedness within societies and across societies. Take just 1, 2 examples in the religious domain. We had a decrease of religiosity, secularization after the 50s, the 60s in particular. And we can understand this because it was the, let's say, the surroundings, May 68, other developments in terms of changes in values. And then in the 2000s, and this was before 9/11, so it was not, it did not depend on the 9/11, it was already observable in the 2000s. Some of the traditional values came back, for instance, family values, fidelity, etc. And then spirituality started to increase again, something like that. Or you may apply this evolutionary understanding to understand why within a particular religious community you may have either change or sameness. So there has been, in parallel to what I was just presenting, many spectacular changes within Catholicism around Vatican II. And today's Catholicism, as you can see, of course, there are not so striking developments to be, let's say, polite. Yeah. So, and you can apply the same, let's say, understanding to explain cross-cultural differences and, in particular, cross-religious differences. If you compare Western Christianity with Eastern Christianity or even Middle East, there may be an explanation in the sense that, of course, they are more conservative, there is more inter-religious prejudice, there are more identitarian religions. But if you take the geography of these places, so Middle East and Eastern Christianity, it's always a kind of frontiers between different civilizations. So you have Turkey, Islam, you have Greece, you have Catholic countries in the Mediterranean, Greece, Israel, and the Arab world. So don't expect to change, if I can say that, very rapidly and very dramatically. Now, parenthesis, okay, there is stability in the variability and there are some changes. And I spoke of the pendulum for the dependence frequency theory. But across the centuries, we can ask the questions whether there is some development on openness to experience or flexibility in humans, in societies. So do humans or societies, and then we can ask for religions, do religions become more progressive, more conservative, or more polarized, with people being both more some being more conservative and some more liberal? Of course, I don't have the answer to this question, but from a cross-cultural psychological perspective, there is some research suggesting that across centuries, humans, societies become more autonomous, then more flexible. So individuality increases, liberal values increase, and social conformity increase, certainly in the West, but also beyond the West. So when other societies have the experience of Westernization, they also follow the same movement. So, first part, it's a bit trivial, but there is some understanding there that, of course, in religion too, you have both continuity, sameness, and change. So but at the end, it's a bit trivial. So perhaps a better question to ask is whether we have rather change or rather continuity and sameness. Or even better, if we have change, what kind of change is within religion? So I will propose 3 or 4 ways to ask this question. The first question is, when we have change, when we speak of change in religion, what are the terms that are used? And it's my feeling that most often we speak of change in religion in terms of adaptation, in terms of acculturation. And then the classic theological argument is, of course, the theology of incarnation. So we have to acculturate it, to incorporate the local culture, something, and then the new culture, the new society, if you think in terms of developments. And then for continuity or sameness is presented as fidelity, as authenticity. And the theological, let's say, understanding there, when I say theological, it's in people's mind, let's say, theology, is of course God's immutability. But if you think in that way, that change is rather an adaptation, and then continuity is rather fidelity and authenticity, this implies, at least implicitly, that change implies some imperfection. So cultures, diversity, to speak, let's say, as a theologian, are post-fall human realities. And new realities, something is there that's not so good for the human perfection. And also, let's say, from more a cognitive psychology perspective, this kind of change is rather an accommodation to a new reality of a pre-existing truth, or at least of a pre-existing knowledge to a new reality, rather than a real development or an advance toward truth to appear. And even going further, if there is too much change in religion, then we suspect alteration. So that was the first question. So in which terms we speak of change? Now, what can change in religion? I think there will be an easy consensus that secondary aspects can change. But primary, essential, fundamental aspects, they need continuity. And this, of course, applies an essentialist approach. The idea is there that there is a kind of essence, a figure, and then in the back you have a kind of form, and this may change, and then you have variants of the same essence, something like that, of the same message, of the same teaching. Then, if we think in that way, it is as if the perfection comes from the past, not from the future. And then the change is not primary discovery, it's not primary progress, improvement, novelty, and creation, strictly speaking. But there is even a more critical question: what is, of course, primary, what is fundamental, and what it is secondary, what is less fundamental? And that's a tricky, I think it's a tricky question. One way to answer this question, and I don't remember who was speaking on this, perhaps in the Archbishop's keynote yesterday, there was something on this. So the distinction, the classic distinction between literal and symbolic interpretation, of course. But you see, it's not, you will see it's not an easy question, distinction. So I will give you here examples. We can imagine a kind of model with 5 levels, something like that, and I can start from the bottom. You have, of course, habits and local traditions, like the language in the liturgy, like gestures in the liturgy, in the ritual, and songs in the liturgy. And I think most people would agree that, okay, here you can make changes. Then you have the interpretation of a, you have the interpretation of a Bible narrative or miracles in the Bible, like the narrative of the creation, the multiplication of loaves and the fish. Some people will adopt a symbolic interpretation, some others not. Then you go with the interpretation, I would say, of well-known biblical teaching about some issues, like homosexuality, like heaven is there. And of course, you have symbolic interpretations, but it's not clear how many adopt them, how many of the believers, I mean, of the faithful, adopt them. Then you go a bit higher, and then you have canon law or ecclesiastic law and ecclesiastic function, the primacy, the synod, the ordination of women, and we feel that this becomes a more sensitive issue. You cannot change that so easily as the miracles and the interpretation of the Bible. And then you go further, of course, but you will see it's not so obvious even what we mean by Father. You have even Trinity God. So let's ask ourselves, at least regarding Western Christianity, who still knows, understands, or even cares about the dogma of the Trinity God in the Western Christianity? And how we interpret that in terms of symbolic interpretation. And the same with resurrection. So what is resurrection? What does it mean, resurrection? And the trick, not only you see that there is a kind of hierarchy, so we have to think or to decide where we can do changes, but the more tricky stuff is that it is an a posteriori distinction. It's always a posteriori that we realize that this was primary and this was secondary. And there is an evolutive distinction. So what today appears as fundamental, it may be that later on, decades or centuries later, it will appear as secondary. So we don't know where now we put forever the distinction between literal and symbolic. And of course, on these issues, that means literal, symbolic, and at which stage of the 5, let's say, levels you put the decision point, there are important cross-religious differences. Okay, you have communities where you can change in none of the 5 levels. Okay, and the only thing that you can change, if I come back to the model, you can change nothing, not even the language in the liturgy, but you can perhaps use technology or tools or this kind of stuff. That's the maximum of change you can imagine. Third way to ask this question within the religions, what kind of change we may have, let's see what are the sources of change in religion, because there is, of course, change in religion. It's my feeling that if we have change in religion, most often is because of external pressure. What is this external pressure? Where this external pressure comes from? It comes from science. New knowledge, for instance, of sexuality. Then we have to wonder what we will do with the traditional morality, on emotions, on body, on laughter, or humor, etc. Ethics, that they are, let's say, from an interdisciplinary perspective of view, they are, let's say, orthogonal to religion, or at least independent from religion. Then from an ethical perspective, you may have change in religion, in terms of autonomy values, men-women equality, etc. And of course, secular societies' norms that are translated in explicit and implicit laws and norms, and of course, all these make some external pressure to religion. Of course, there is also internal pressure. There are theological developments. There is ecumenism. Though, okay, it's a big question. What has changed after ecumenism? And in which places there have been changes? But anyway, there are internal developments, prophetic, visionary voices, and founders of new religious orders, new religious movements. On the other hand, it's a bit trivial what I'm saying, that the pressure comes from the exterior, because that's for almost most domains of life, in fact. But see science. I think science per se may have, let's say, may put at least equal weight to internal pressures in terms of internal developments. So if we think in that way, change in religion is more a kind of enrichment rather than an adaptation, but it is an adaptation, but rather than a replacement. So I was thinking when Judith in her keynote mentioned, I think it was St. Paul's sentence on, now we see a bit of the light and then it will be plenty of light. Okay, so this, how we can understand these sentences more in terms of enrichment. It will not be another reality or a new reality, but an enrichment. So that's the model there. And see what happened in the Catholic Church in the last years regarding the enormous discussion about women's ordination. Enrichment, John Paul II. Okay, no change, but we understand in a more deeper way, in a more deep way, the thing. Okay. So at that point, I would say I was really interested to see, are there models, I don't know, in sociology of change, etc. What are the kinds of change? Okay. But I didn't want to act in that way, and let's say I adopted a more intuitive perspective. What are the models in people's mind, the models of change in people's mind? So one strategy I often use is to put the word change in Google images, and to see what are the images there. So how people represent change. And you will see there is a nice variety that make us think a bit. So first, you change direction. Can we apply that in religion? I'm not sure, but perhaps there may be examples. Even further, change in direction alone, and then all the others are doing something else. I don't know, but perhaps some changes in the Anglican Church in the previous years have been something like that. Then you may have changed like the butterfly here, that it is a kind of radical transformation of what was originally there. I was thinking we may apply this to Judaism and Christianity. So something goes there, and then the new product, if you like, it's perhaps pretty different from the original one, but of course there are here in the room more experts than me, so it's just a speculative idea. Then you may have change as chance, as a challenge. Or in the same way, change as a way to make things that seem impossible, to make them possible. And in that way, there is also the time perspective, that it becomes urgent and you need to change. So this kind of external pressure coming from time, perhaps that was the case with Vatican II. But you have also a model of change in the representation on people's minds as a discursive process. That was another image, and I will not give the answer, but we can wonder ourselves whether this applies, let's say, traditionally to churches. And you may have also a model of representation of change as, let's say, progress, let's say, going in the good direction in the advance of history, something like that. And perhaps against the others or something like that. And then you may have this model representing change, that it is a kind of reformulation, reorganization, something like that. So you choose the model that you think that it fits better to religion. I have a personal preference for the last one, but okay, that's, let's say, as it is the beginning of thinking about that, I will not polemicate with somebody else if you prefer another one. Now, let's take an example of the question whether things change, for instance, in religious morality, that I think it's a bit prototypical regarding religious homophobia. So, have there been changes on religious homophobia or not? And that's totally empirical psychology of religion, what I will present you here. So, of course, we know that traditionally, from a religious and theological perspective, there is a kind of condemnation of homosexuality. And this is at the moral and the social level. That means there is a moral consideration, but also a social deconsideration of homosexuality for religious reasons. But, of course, we have to be careful. It's not religion that causes homophobia, okay? It is a social phenomenon, and religion amplifies homophobia, legitimizes homophobia. And this, again, as it is not religion that causes homophobia, then regarding religious homophobia, we have a parallelism with what is going on in society. And the whole psychological and sociological research from the 60s to the 90s was confirming this, that when you have empirical studies, religiosity, so the more people are religious versus less religious or non-religious, the more they feel homophobia, or to use a more technical term, sexual prejudice. And this concerns all forms of religiosity, all world religions, and all forms of prejudice. So not only moral deconsideration, but also discrimination in terms of behavior in the lab, irrational beliefs, the AIDS has been produced, or COVID has been produced because of, that was the Bishop of Piraeus who said that a few months ago. And aggression, okay, really aggression, I mean physical aggression. So that's traditionally, I mean, last century. Of course, there have been changes, societal changes. All forms of sexual prejudice have decreased, so they have decreased, both at the explicit and the implicit level. Of course, at the explicit level, it's more clear, so people will not dare to say, okay, I don't like gays, but implicitly, research shows still, of course, we are prejudiced, something like that. And also, research shows that this, let's say, decrease applies more to moral deconsideration, so people don't say that it is immoral, but still at the social level they are not so happy if their neighborhoods will be a gay couple or something like that. Now, I think it may be interesting here to say that we have research, including in our lab, where we try to clarify this question. The conflict between conservatives and liberals in different issues legiferation, so acceptance, legal acceptance of gay adoption, and the same for legal acceptance of abortion, is it due to difference between conservatives and progressive regarding empathy, care, and this kind of pro-social values? Because the argument is that we are against, for instance, gay adoption because we have to protect the weak, the children who need two parents, and the same for abortion. So the argument is pro-social. We found that there is no difference between conservatives and liberals on that. The difference is on the other values, that is social conformity, respect of the authority, loyalty of the in-group, and purity in the sense of respecting what is sacred or traditional, versus autonomy. So the conflict is on whether, on very complicated moral issues, it is the individual who decides or it is the society that has to decide. No difference in care, empathy, and this kind of pro-social values. So, nevertheless, so there have been societal changes in the direction of less prejudice, less sexual prejudice, but of course, still it is there. And there are important cross-cultural differences if you compare, I don't know, Sweden with Pakistan, something like that. Now, the question is, have been similar religious changes? First point, yes, there have been changes. For instance, more and more, across at least the Western Christianity, there has been an emphasis on the importance to distinguish between hating the sin and loving the sinner. Okay, John Paul, all the popes, that means in the last decades, argue this, and I think it's the same across all religious Christian traditions and even other monotheistic religions. And a second change, an emphasis on the distinction between orientation, sexual orientation, then you have to respect because who knows, perhaps this is natural. We cannot ask people to be moral about the orientation they have, but we should ask people to be moral about their behavior. So this is, let's say, progress. It's change. I would not qualify that, at least in Western Christianity. And very subtle change in some sociological research, we find that, of course, religiosity still predicts moral condemnation of homosexuality, but not social condemnation. To say that simply, people continue, religious people, to say morally it's not so good, but this is not, of course, an issue if you have as neighbors a gay couple. And even further, across, let's say, if not the world, across many countries, the mean level of religious homophobia decreased. So there have been religious changes, and these changes parallel the societal changes. That's the point. And of course, I don't think if somebody would have an opposite argument, there have been theological developments, but this followed the external pressure, of course. Now, yes, there have been changes, but they are minor changes, and there is heavy continuity, despite what I just presented. To give 3-4 empirical examples, there was a nice study across many countries published in 3-4 years ago. Across countries, the distinction between hating the sin and loving the sinner, that it is well endorsed by the religious believers when we ask them in self-reports whether they endorse it. So this is well endorsed. But this distinction serves to legitimize sexual prejudice as a function of religiosity. Okay? So the more you believe that, yes, I distinguish this between loving the sinner and hating the sin, the more you are doing sexual prejudice. So it's tricky. Eh? And this is a bit subtler. Across the decades, especially if you see sociological research, ethnic prejudice or interreligious prejudice as a function of religiosity, so believers versus non-believers, whether they do ethnic and interreligious prejudice, this prejudice has diminished. But sexual prejudice has diminished less. And even further, we have many studies in our lab showing that Eastern Asian religiosity, Buddhism, etc., predicts tolerance of other ethnic groups and other religious groups. But even the Buddhists, if you want, when it comes to sexual prejudice, that's more difficult. Let's say that's more difficult. That's another story, something like that. And even more subtle, let's say, problem. I don't know if you are familiar with the word religious priming. This means that you prime, you activate subliminally, or supraliminally religious words or religious mindset. To give you just one example, a colleague of mine in the Netherlands, he interviewed people just in front of the church. So they were not exiting the mass, they were just walking, and he asked them, he gave him reports outside the church versus in another condition, a square in the same city. What happened when you prime religion? People were more sexist, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrants, and anti-gays. So it's terrible. I mean, and it's not the only study. There are now several studies. So even today, that's the last line here, even today in secular Western countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, still a religious mindset activates beyond awareness of people homophobia, prejudice, and other kinds of prejudice. And even more surprising, while the mean levels of religious homophobia decrease, so religious people become less homophobic, that's really tricky. The correlations, so the associations between religiosity and sexual prejudice increased in secular countries compared to religious countries, to traditional countries. To say that in non-statistical terms, the discrepancy between believers and non-believers on sexual prejudice becomes bigger in size in the religious countries, in the secular countries compared to the religious countries. So what's going on here? One hypothesis is that we may have a kind of religious radicalization, so the believers become even more prejudiced. But this is not the case, as I just said, in fact. And this situation comes from the fact that it is the liberals who went too far, if you like. So in traditional societies, everybody agrees in sexual prejudice. But in secular countries, there is a big discrepancy. Then you have more and more a conflict. That's a problem. Not the problem. I don't care. I am just a scholar. I tell you what is the situation. Let's say. So the moral divergence and the moral conflict increase in the secular countries because of this. And again, across all these results of studies on religious homophobia, we get this feeling that even when religion adapts, still always there is a kind of décalage between what's going on in society and what is going on in religion. And this is not, I took this as a prototypical example, but it is not the only example. So we have other research in our lab. So if you remember my first argument on religion and humor, laughter, we thought that it is something, an old story of condemnation, but we had, that was my PhD, in fact, a series of research, and others continue in that direction. So it's still the case. There is a conflict. Not always. It depends what you are measuring exactly. But it is amazing. Many studies showing that the more people are religious, the less they do, they create humor spontaneously. So when they are in a situation when they don't know what you are measuring, in fact. Okay, so it's not a situation of celebrating. Okay, it's a situation in the lab. They think that we are testing their coping styles, and then we found that they produce spontaneously humor less. And even worse, if you can, so less spontaneous humor creation, and less use or appreciation of many kinds of humor, including social humor, including as evaluated by spouses. So this is totally enormous. It is, the partner, the spouse is religious, and then his wife or his husband finds him less humorous. So it's, yeah, and you see the method. So the peer evaluator, so the spouse peer evaluator, we have not activated the religiousness of the target. Okay, it's independent. It's we as researchers that we make the association. And even in secular countries. So I'm not speaking here of the, let's say, the seminarist or the students in the midrash, or we speak about psychology students in Belgium, in Louvain that are no more Catholics. There is no strong religiosity. just to tell you a bit the reactions that I was listening when I presented the studies in the 2000s in the US and Greece. So the reaction is, that's the Belgian Catholics. So both the Americans say, that's the Belgian Catholics, and the Greeks say, that's the Belgian Catholics. Instead of doing the opposite, and I am sorry to say that because it's a kind of very common strategy to criticize the research of others, instead of wondering the following: do I have arguments that in my culture things will be different? That's the intelligent strategy to say, but okay. And the other is, of course, people who said, I know a priest who has a good sense of humor, and I answer, me too, it's my father. Okay, so that was about humor. Then you have, more generally, the relations between religion and sexuality. When we started this kind of research in our lab, I remember there was an assistant of Catholic tradition, almost pious, I would say, and she said, wow, guys, because I had a new assistant, she would work for 6 years with me, and she said, there is no more conflict in the Catholic world between sexuality within a couple and religion. And then I believe that. I didn't have a stereotype, let's say, but then in several studies we found, and other scholars found the same, that religiosity is associated not only with low unconventional sexual behavior, but also conventional sexual behavior within the marriage, and low, for instance, sexual frequency, or low sexual desire, even among married people. Today, I mean, in the Western Europe. And even high guilt. So religiosity relates to high sexual guilt. And even in very secular countries. Now, when we had the first time we submitted the paper, I had, of course, American reviewers. I imagine that they were of another, perhaps, religious tradition, and they were hostile to the findings. And the argument was, okay, but you need to focus on married people and what they are experiencing. And I know of very good colleagues and friends of mine in the US who have created constructs like sanctification of sexuality. I really believe that's a strategy. That means, because, of course, they found that people who score high in sanctification of sexuality, that means they sacralize their sexuality, they report higher sexual satisfaction. Of course, but it's a tautological argument, of course. If you think that it is good, then you are happy, something like that. So what are the strategies here? If we take the examples I gave you, minimization. You say, okay, there are some, but there are others who are different. Okay, but that's a question of numbers. It depends on what the majority of people do, and this is what the studies say. Or even denial. Or dissociation, projection of the bad self to others. Okay, that's the Belgian Catholics, it's not the American Christians or Protestant Americans, charismatic Americans, etc. Or obscuring rhetoric like sanctification of sexuality. Then, as a last, let's say, chapter in this presentation, I got the idea, okay, let's see what the psychology of resistance to change can tell us, and may be perhaps useful to understand what's going on in religion. So, what are the factors that may undermine religious change? So, change in general, and I will apply to religion with a few examples. So, I give now factors that in general are found in research to undermine change in general, and we will make the exercise to apply that in religion. First, of course, personality characteristics, but that's obvious because I said that there are people who are conservative, almost by nature, and people who are liberal, and I would say there is almost nothing to do. And in fact, if we see the research, religiosity does not go with dogmatism. Okay, religiosity goes together with some need for order and structure, that it is conscientiousness, something like that, but not necessarily with low openness to experience. This means that we can easily find within religion both open-minded and closed-minded people. Now, what are the situational factors that undermine change in general? First, an awareness of the need to change, sitting in a comfort zone and having then poor motivation to change. An example from the religious domain, orthodoxy in the Balkans. That means when the archbishop is considered as third or fourth in the protocol after the president and the prime minister, and let's say the church is sitting in a very comfortable position, why to change? Fear of the unknown, fear of the failure, but that's a classical one, so I will not comment more on that. Authoritarian, non-discursive structure. It's my impression, I think we cannot be totally in disagreement that religious hierarchies are not, let's say, discursive. And see what happened with the discussion about women's ordination in the Catholic Church. At least it's the majority of Western Catholics are in favor. We know that. The authority says no. And it's amazing, because it's the opposite from what's going on to companies. In companies, the employers won't change, and the employees are a bit tired and say, goodness, no change, we are tired. Here we have the opposite. The faithful won't change, and then the authority says, no, we have to be prudent. And enrichment, as we just mentioned. I think also the next argument, the next factor is important, low trust to leaders. And I will give you an example that I know more personally from the situation in the Greek Orthodox at least, and even the other areas of the Orthodox world. You are all familiar with the problem that the Orthodox world, let's say, has important parts of population who have anti-ecumenical feelings. And let's say the leader of the anti-ecumenical movement in Greece, it's a friend of mine. At least we were together students in theology. So these people have a problem in terms of, let's say, ethical consideration of their religious leaders. And they are not totally wrong, I would say. So there is something there. If you don't trust the leaders, how you will trust the change? And here it's the ecumenism that it is proposed. Cognitive dissonance with your beliefs. So if let's take the 5 levels we saw, and then let's take synod, primacy, the ecclesiastic law, or dogmas, how to change. That means you have cognitive dissonance. You cannot have a belief that it is total in opposition with your previous beliefs. And in fact, I suspect that the more a religious system is integralist, the harder it is to change, of course, because if you move something, then everything is supposed to move. Just a bit too anecdotal as an example, but I think it's revealing. So I think you have followed that across religious traditions, there has been much opposition by some faithful against vaccination and the mask, etc. And in the Orthodox Church, the problem has been the Holy Communion. And several priests or bishops tried to find an alternative. So as you know, there is only one spoon. And then you have 100 people who will take the communion with the same spoon. Okay? Then bishops and priests started to propose alternatives like having many spoons, individual ones, or even plastic ones. Nobody succeeded to establish that in the Orthodox world because of the reaction of faithful, even sometimes aggressively. And some arguments, I realized that all the priests say, spoon, give me the spoon. Now we say the holy spoon. And even further, I saw the argument that the holy spoon is the Virgin Mary that gave birth to Christ. So it gives us Christ, something like that. So cognitive dissonance, let's say, with what we believed before. And this factor is also interesting, exhaustion. Saturation. This may be the case with post-Vatican II Catholicism. There have been so many changes, so there is a bit, they are tired a bit. You cannot change always in many different levels. The other one, lack of competence, unpreparedness to change. For instance, I'm sorry to say that, but there is no real place for human sciences, and especially sciences of religion, within the Orthodox world and within Islam. How you can have change if you don't have external pressure from these kind of disciplines? Age. The more the experts or the leaders are aged, the less you can change. This, of course, refers to hierarchy, but also to the members of the churches who we know are a bit older than the average population, on average. And you have specific to religion theology factors, like, of course, truth coexists, but also the community is eternal and glorious. And this gives you the idea of invulnerability. So why to change? There is no risk. The church will be always present and glorious. There is no need to change. more subtle. It was, I think, in John Paul's some documents. So, where there have been accidents, errors, faults, the sentence is, these are the sins of the sons and the daughters of the church. But the good things is the church. Okay, it's a nice strategy. So the good things, that's the church. It's made good things, but the bad things are the sons and the daughters of the church. It's a classic mechanism of projection of the bad, let's say, to others, of the bad self to others. And also a subtle mechanism, the failures within our community are due to the church enemies. I don't say that journalists like the religion, sorry, to speak of all religions, but I think there is something more there. It's almost a kind of conspiracy feeling that journalists, the media are against religion, and I think most often they are just doing their job. A very subtle argument specific to religion theology factors against change is the problem with numbers. So within the religion, you have several people who are suspicious of numbers. So they like the qualitative, but they don't like the quantitative. And this is tricky, because then you minimize the indicators that say there is a problem. We may have no priests if we don't ordain women. Then you use the vulnerability argument. Church will always be there, but you don't see the numbers. And of course, another major argument, it's the painful experience of schism. Okay, you may imagine many changes, but of course you have a community. You cannot open the window very large because of schism, of the risk for schism. And I think there is also the fact that, of course, you have conservatives and liberals as everywhere, but the conservatives, at least within religion, for sure, they are more aggressive, they are more pressing. And I think, psychologically speaking, what is there? The problem is a kind of obsessionality for purity, and it is a lack of competition. The more strict the rules you apply, the better you are, something like that. It's a kind of moral competition that we can call obsessionality. And of course, the classical source of problem, tensions between theologians, people and hierarchy, or hierarchy and mystics, prophets, and trusted holy figures. And of course, the minimization of laics, at least for Catholicism and Orthodoxy that I know, and Islam, it's another story. And okay, I will not make more comments on that, but we see the point here. So, conclusive thoughts. Religion's very natural, of course, it's fidelity to pre-existing truth. That we have to acknowledge that. So the truth comes from a pivotal moment in the past. It's a book, it's a revelation, it's a personal experience. And this is independent from other criteria of truth like efficiency, rationality, correspondence to reality, etc. So the previous are first. Otherwise, there is no more religion. Okay, we have to acknowledge that. And this goes together with a kind of fidelity to pre-existing normativity. In rituals, you have to respect some structure at least. Otherwise, there is no sacramental efficiency. In norms, behavior, otherwise there is no salvation. In community, otherwise there is heresy and you are ostracized. And if you are familiar a bit, some may be familiar with the model that we have developed of the 4 Bs. So in religion, clearly you have believing, bonding, behaving, and belonging, beliefs, rituals, norms, and community. So what it is there is authenticity with regard to all these 4 aspects. So if this is the scenario, then the consequences are, of course, there is change. But I think we overemphasize change. We don't see, let's say, the problem of the sameness. And we have to accept that change in religion is under heavy limits. And if there is change, it is better in terms of adaptation of the same and continuity. And this obliges the religious leaders, but also theologians, but also faithful, to use this rhetoric. So when they change, in fact, they claim continuity. So they need to claim continuity, absolute continuity. And then when they claim adaptation, we can suspect that there is sameness. And the examples I used regarding homosexuality, sexuality, emotions and body, humor and laughter, we can apply this rhetoric. Change by pretending continuity or sameness though claiming adaptation. And finally, you may have discrepancies between people and institutions theology that perhaps parallel the discrepancies between law and what people think, feel, and experience. So if you take, for instance, the laws in the US on racism, xenophobia, they have been always more progressive than people's reality. Okay? And the same with theology. Theology proposed changes that often are much farther than the experience of people, the religious people. Or you may have the opposite. And this is more the case with issues on family, sexuality, etc. Law often follows societal change. So changes on family issues, on sexuality issues are much more rapid in society, and then law follows. And the same with religious institutions, in fact. They are perhaps too inert with regard to religious people's reality on moral issues. And finally, this comes back to the big issue, how religions regulate the relations to society. So to survive, of course, they have to follow the societal change. But they do that with some delay, with inertia. So they have always to find an equilibrium between the two extreme positions. Being too different, too traditional, there is the risk to be sectarian and outdated. But if you are too similar, then you are no more attractive. Who will come to you? And this comes back to the concept of minimal optimal distinctiveness. So you need to be somehow different from the others if you want to attract members. So for those who are interested on that, but the professor introduced this book, but more specifically in terms of continuity across, similarity across religions and continuity across societies on religious morality, but also some changes and some cross-cultural differences. I think that's perhaps a not bad chapter of review of the research of 60 pages in this volume, Religion and Morality Across Cultures. So I think I am arriving at the end, and it's 7:1. So thank you a lot for your attention and patience.
Yes, thank you very much. Excuse me for pointing at my watch. I'm in favor of continuity, but I think we needed a change from your presentation to a discussion. As I assume there are questions, my proposal would be that we send all these people home and you and I go sit down on the terrace and talk about your paper, but that would not be polite. So questions in the room, and then I will check also the chat. Who is first? Yep.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Wait a minute, the microphone doesn't work.
Yes, I will not count a joke about Franciscans and Jesuits, that I am quite good at telling this kind of jokes to show our sense of humor. But there are two issues that are important for me. One, what is your opinion about the sociological tradition that spans from Max Weber to Niklas Luhmann, that clearly shows that in the Western history, religious changes are precedent or are the cause of big social changes? So in Niklas Luhmann, for instance, how the semantic, social semantic was causing the structural changes. And second question, we have had access to a big data set, the EuARe project, many analysis of religion project. It was a data set of 10,500 cases. And our team, analyzing the data, discovered, for instance, that there was an item in the questionnaire on sexual satisfaction that religious people were more satisfied than unaffiliated people. The correlation was 0.2 and very significant, as you can imagine. So perhaps in the past was true what you say, but this data set at least was showing clearly. Well, Hinduists were more satisfied, Buddhists less satisfied, Christians and Muslims in the middle, but the less affiliated were the less satisfied. So how could we explain regarding to your thesis this data?
Lovely. Thank you. So for the first question, this is why I put the very, very early slide by saying that I will I will focus only on individuals, their feelings, personality, attitudes, and behavior. Exactly, because I don't want to play the role of sociologist and have an answer specifically regarding your first argument. But from a psychological perspective, the data are there. That means the continuity is there. If we take the personality characteristics of religion that are good, agreeableness and conscientiousness, they are today, they are cross-religious, they are cross-cultural, and we find them in documents of the canonization 3 centuries ago. And there is this strong continuity, and I think, and now I play the role of this interdisciplinary discussion between sociology and psychology, though I will not argue as a sociologist, the difference comes from the fact that sociology, of course, focuses on changes. That's, let's say, their primary job often, at least the more sociological work we know about religion. Psychology, we are always struggling between what is universal, what it is individual or cultural, etc. So we focus a bit more on universal stuff. But I don't have an answer to the first question other than this discrepancy between psychological continuity in some findings and sociological. And both are important, in fact. Now, for the second, if I missed the word, so you were speaking of sexual satisfaction. Okay, good. Because I prepared the introduction for the article we submit, and it's a tricky stuff. Why it's a tricky stuff? Because it's self-report. So it's just paper and pencil answers, and then the religious people in some traditions, in some communities, the more they are religious, the more, by the way, okay, we have not prime religiousness. They say that they are happy with sexuality. I believe that. Let's say, I believe that they think that. Okay? Now, the question is, can we have more, because let's say now to be negative, if I speak not to theologians, but to my students, but then it comes like the cults and the sects. They say they are happy, okay? Okay, it's a bit extreme as a comparison, but that's a bit the point. So that's why I mentioned here as indicators sexual guilt. That's a bit tricky. But you're right, it's not universal. There are important cross-religious differences. For instance, in our study, we found that Muslims who are married and they are religious, they have less sex, but they don't feel necessary more guilt. They have no necessary less sexual desire within marriage. So that's my answer to, let's say, to the fresh information you give about your results. That's why sexual satisfaction, it's not the definite answer because it's very self-report information and we need more objective measures, and the objective measures are there. Religious people start sex later, they have less frequent relationships, so they are more, let's say, conservative in their sexuality. But they are more happy. Okay, why not? It may be possible. Yeah, that's a...
Other questions, maybe on a different topic, because in Germany this is usually for after 10 at night. So there's 2 questions there. Yep.
Thank you very much indeed for a wonderfully illuminating paper. I wanted to pick up one particular issue, and that was the presence together of the authoritarian culture of many religious communities with the suspicion of religious leaders and the lack of trust in religious leadership that you identify in the same kind of bracket. And I wonder if I could prompt you to say a little bit more about that apparently rather paradoxical correlation. You'd think that in an authoritarian community there would be high levels of trust towards religious leaders. But I just offer this as a thought. Is it the case that as our cultures have developed, you might say authoritarianism has been privatized? That's to say, the more general expectation there is of making decisions that you are in charge of culturally, socially, the less you will trust traditional authority and leadership. But that doesn't necessarily mean you won't want to exercise authority within the group that you're actually most committed to. But I don't know, I'm thinking out loud here, but it seems to me that there is something very interesting about that presence together, which you see so often in highly conservative Catholic, Orthodox, for that matter, Anglican groups, where the culture is very much top-down, and yet there is a systematic, or sometimes a positively Manichaean hostility to traditional or legitimized religious leadership. So I'd love to hear more thoughts on that.
Thanks a lot. It's an enormous question, and I'm not sure that I got all the aspects of your question, because I had, let's say, a bit difficulty with the premises of the question, and then I was a bit distracted to think on that. I'm not so sure that I put in the same exactly level the idea of authoritarian structure that does not facilitate change and low trust to leaders who propose change. But you're right, the two may be together. But I'm not sure that the two processes are exactly the same. So first, the authoritarian leader, I'm not sure that he's trusted by the followers. He's feared and then they obey. But I'm not sure that there is trust. That's a bit the first thought I had in the premise of your question, that I lost then the continuation of the question. And the second is that it's an indirect answer to the first part of the question, at least, that research also shows that when people abandon religion, the first reason they mention is immorality of the religious leaders. And this is a bit independent from the authoritarian structure, something like that. That's all, but I am sorry, I'm not deeply within the development of your question. That was the beginning of my thoughts in the beginning of your intervention. Yeah. But I will be happy to continue to discuss on this. And also, I have no idea about, let's say, how things work in terms of authoritarian structure in the Protestant and the Anglican world. I think pretty well things in the Catholic and the Orthodox world, and I think the model applies or applied much more in the Catholic world in Europe, let's say some decades ago. Yeah, something like that, yeah. Yeah.
Another question in the Franciscan corner there.
Yeah, he's a Franciscan too? The other guy? Okay. Okay. We don't listen.
Very much for your presentation. I have three brief questions. One, I was intrigued by your use of quite charged terms, some would say derogative, such as the use of homophobia, sexual prejudice, and obsessionality to describe those of more traditional beliefs. So would that be the equivalent of calling every Christian until the 1960s a homophobe, prejudiced, or obsessed? So I'm wondering if it would be maybe fitting to adopt more neutral terms. Perhaps there are other reasons other than homophobia to still appreciate traditional biblical sexuality. Related to this, as second question.
May I come to this, because my problem is distraction. I will forget the 3 points I have. It's okay, you will remember yours?
What's that?
You will remember your other 2 points, then
yes.
I can answer the first one. Huh?
Okay.
Okay. Let's say, technically you are right. I don't have any problem to replace sexual prejudice or homophobia by the very neutral term, and sometimes I use that to have my article accepted by American reviewers, homonegativity. Okay, it's just, but that's the first, let's say, and I don't enter to this debate, but you are right, we can use an alternative term. I don't have a problem with that. So I don't have, let's say, kind of implicit politics to promote the term homophobia or sexual prejudice. But these are the established terms in social psychology. So it's a kind of convention. Now, the other stuff is that contrary to what this may apply, that one can believe that, let's say, I consider homophobia as a, let's say, social problem so quickly, like, so I will say that differently. It's the same situation with racism. Of course, homophobia, it's not something that will, or negativity, whatever, that will disappear. There are very, very deep reasons, evolutionary ones, and it's the same with racism. Racism will not disappear. The only thing will be a kind of cultural, let's say, awareness of the problem, and then religious or ethical progress on dealing with this question. That's all. Yeah, for the first.
The second one is related. It's whether there might be a risk of a rising prejudice or intolerance against those who hold more traditional beliefs. And that's kind of the paradox, that the more liberal, the more tolerant a society becomes, then it starts to become intolerant towards those who still agree with and love the traditional Christian beliefs as held by not only in Scripture, but also, let's say, 1950 years of Christian tradition.
Thank you for this question, because it gives me the opportunity to make a kind of happy self-affirmative argument. I am the guy who started research on the prejudice of the atheists against the believers. Okay, we have now 4 studies published, and now there are other colleagues who are doing the same job, never mind their religious orientation and their inherent atheism or not, and we prove that in the secular Europe, atheists are prejudiced not only against anti-liberals, like anti-gays and fundamentalists, but even against simple religious believers, and to go even further, not only Muslims, not only even Christians that were the dominant, but even Buddhists. So in our research, and this includes 3 countries, UK, Spain, you are from Spain, I think, no?
No, Canada.
Okay, Spain and France, I think. The atheists like more as a neighbor a Chinese than a Buddhist. Okay, so you're right. Of course there is, but I go speaking to theologians. When I will speak to atheists, I will say the other part of the story in terms of prejudice. But you're right, of course. And I'm happy because things go further. That means I have even published in Belgian newspaper an important article, I would say important, sorry, a courageous article accusing the prejudice and the dogmatism and the fundamentalism of the laicism. Yeah.
Thank you. Third question is a little more theological. You spoke of fidelity to pre-existing truth. And it wasn't clear to me at what point, in your opinion, does change, which is the topic of this conference, does it become a betrayal of the Christian faith as conveyed in Scripture and tradition? I mean, the New Testament speaks often of guarding the good deposit entrusted to you. So there's this idea of passing down what has been received from Christ and the apostles. So how do you draw that line between change that is positive and change that's a betrayal of the Christian faith? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the third question also. I don't have, let's say, a very well-built answer. It's just that I have to acknowledge that this is the very nature of religion if we have to distinguish, socially speaking, religion from philosophy, from modern spirituality, from political ideologies, etc. This kind of some reference to something that comes from the past. And I am not naive. This is part of religion. If we don't accept this, then there is no more religion, okay? So something in terms, when I say truth pre-exists, perhaps it may appear as negative or as a pejorative, but it is only an observation, but that's the very nature of religion. I personally, let's say as a psychologist, I don't have a problem with that. So we have to accept that, and the big issue is, okay, what people are doing with this truth that comes a bit from the past. Now, how much of the religious teaching, beliefs, etc., belongs to this past, and how much is new or different? I'm not a theologian, let's say, at this moment. So, yeah. But thanks for the thing.
Thank you. Hans-Peter Goossens.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this landscape you made here, going through all the possibilities, how you can tackle from your subject the question of change in religion. So I found this very interesting. I have, I don't know, not very important questions, I would say, but say because you come to personality psychology, I would say the most important change in religion is in an individual life, the change from disbelief to faith. So, and this has also consequences for the practice, and now to say new realities in the world. Very exciting development is, say, what some call neo-Pentecostalism, giving a label to rich development of creating new communities with new liturgies, mainly always having the same song, that was the Sameness, kind of English, 20 songs everybody's singing. So young people wanted to be part of the one world and therefore sharing the same music. And so here it's also expression, say, on a, I would say, individual of, say, way of change and going into new forms of religion. So therefore I'm a bit challenging you in the sense, did you not have a too fixed, monolithic concept of religion here, and saying I had the imagination that you are looking like an Orthodox world or in Catholic world, and you see young people, for example, they go into new forms. So the change is not going into the religion, but it's much more competition there, and there are alternatives somewhere else. So this is going to more the individual level. I have again.
Can
so
I
yeah,
answer?
please.
Yeah. 2 points. So, of course, you're right. I mean, so these changes are there, new forms, and as it was a bit landscape, of course, it may be a bit, let's say, monolithic in a way. But let's say, phenomenologically, you are right. These are new forms or different forms, etc. But there is, again, and then I come to the first question, a kind of sociological exaggeration of how much these are changes. And we had this morning a symposium on modern spirituality, and then one of the speakers presented interviews from new Catholics who have new personalized, individualized rituals and new forms. And then when you ask it more deeply what's going on, no, it's the same rituals. There is some adaptations, they can choose the text. Okay, they can add some songs, etc. So I'm a bit prudent that there is too much sociological, let's say, emphasis on the new forms, etc. But I think you no more have religion if you invent something totally new. So you can't create even a cult, but to be efficient, you have to refer to a kind of teacher who comes from very far in the time, something like that. And that's the very nature of religion, let's say. So that would be, let's say, my first point to this question. And the second is that personality, there are different levels. There are the basic traits like openness to experience, that they are biological influence. And then you have, let's say, a more superficial levels like identities, self-concept, values, etc. Then when people convert or deconvert, research shows that they change in these levels, the second, the third level, identity, etc. But the basic personality is there, something like that. But that's a bit the first. Okay, and the second, yeah.
I have then also an institutional question to your reflections. You see, if I look to the history of my church, so the more Lutheran Protestant churches, in the 20th century there have been two major reforms, I call it now, changes which I call reforms. That was female ordination and new governance structure according the division of labor, say, according Montesquieu in 3 parts and so on. So I would say this second reform and change, which major, because then the authority is not any longer with the bishop, but with the synod, and the bishop has not even a vote in the synod sometimes. Then this is a really major change in governance. So I would say this is more a result of, say, imagination of people and intellectual, so intellectual imagination than rather, say, a psychological, say, explanation possible that people, whatever, you gave a lot of possibilities to think that, I mean, there's always psychology involved, but I'm not so satisfied to look only on this psychological level if it comes to institutional changes, because there's so much discourse, and you need new ideas, new understandings, and you need new justifications. And then you have, it's a reduction to general, whatever, psychological status of the majority. This is not really plausible to me.
I think, thanks for the question, but the answer is easy. I didn't pretend that this is the explanation. I just propose one psychological, let's say, explanation, and we know that there are many, many others in addition. So I totally agree, let's say, but, and then coming back to Protestantism in particular, of course, we know that it is a big, let's say, historical development. So what's going on? There is, with the situation you describe, there is no need to have psychological explanations. There has been an historical process, Weber, capitalism, autonomy, liberal values, Protestantism, and this is now, let's say, reciprocal bidirectional developments. We don't even need psychology, so we agree totally. But I never pretend that psychology can explain all things, just we are paid to say something for psychological.
I will check the chat, see if there's any question there. No, so there's room for one question, please. Unless you have one question in three.
Just one question, and I'm talking as a Catholic theologian, not as a psychologist or anything. I would just like to build on what you just said on the question before, and on this claim of continuity based on a fidelity to a pre-existing truth. And I wonder, this doesn't seem to me to do justice to this fundamental eschatological dimension of the Christian faith. It seems to me that the truth is not lying in the past, as you just said, but is in front of us. And am I wrong in your opinion?
First, you had the answer from the first keynote, so I will not enter to this discussion. But my only answer is the following. Of course, that's a theological argument. Do you have the impression that the citizens in your community or in your country, the believers, think in that way? So they are... that's, of course. I don't have any difficulty with that. I just describe how people are today, how believers are today. And the only thing is that if we notice that this is something for centuries, then the theologian needs to start thinking what's going on. If for centuries we think that there is this eschatological truth that will come, and then the believers just want to know how the old guys have done for centuries. Yeah. But yeah, theologically I agree with you, but psychologically, yeah, we have a problem.
Thank you very much for your answers, your responses, and you've learned from the questions that you really encouraged us to think and think things through. We have time to talk during the reception. Thanks also for the questions from the audience, but most of all, we will give an applause to our presenter for tonight.
Thank you to your questions. Thank you.
So now you're all invited for the reception outside between the two buildings where we have the sessions. And I wish you a pleasant evening.